Okay. I want to start this lecture on the attention economy by talking, perhaps unexpectedly, about General Motors, a company that makes cars. But they no longer make much of their money from making cars, which is an interesting thing to know. And telling the story of how that came to be the case will be hugely illuminating about the dynamics that were brought forward in this week's readings and the lectures you listened to from Eli Parasar and Zeynep Tufekci. A publicly traded company in a capitalist economy, i.e., a company that trades shares on a regulated exchange like the New York Stock Exchange, uh, thrives on growth. The companies that have good stock prices in the stock exchanges are not those who made a lot of money in the past. They are those that investors believe are well positioned to make a lot of money in the future. After all, a share in a company is a claim on that company's future profits. Past profits are great, but they're only of interest insofar as they suggest that the firm might be more profitable in the future as a track record. It's not enough for the stock market to just provide a stably profitable business. This is why the hottest stocks are more likely to be unprofitable technology companies with a chance to provide insanely huge future returns, and not like electrical utilities who are highly regulated in what they're able to charge customers. And so they tend to make steady profits year after year unless they burn down the entire state of California and are thus liable for tens of billions of dollars worth of damages. So back to what we were saying. Investors want growth. They don't want stability. And so a stock market is a contest to convince these investors that you are going to generate more profits than other firms in the future. The investors don't care if the companies they invest their capital in sell cars or bananas or cell phones or electricity or what have you, so long as they provide growth. The problem facing the executives who run these businesses, then, is how to provide that growth. Let's look, then, at the history of General Motors. GM dates back about 100 years to 1918. It's the result of the merger of some pre-existing companies, but whatever. The company quickly grew to be one of the most effective in the world at not only producing high-quality cars, but bringing them to market. Remember, the point of a capitalist firm is not to make things and satisfy people's needs. It's to sell things, and to sell more things than you sold last year. So as a company, you have a problem. If you get too good at making cars that are too awesome and making too many of them too quickly, you risk saturating your potential market, which is to say, selling a car to everyone who wants a car and can afford a car. If you do that, then you're stuck. Now, that might sound fantastical, but this isn't an abstract problem. The story of another, less iconic American transportation manufacturing company illustrates the problem: the Budd Company of Philadelphia. The ghost of this company still lingers as a bundle of patents that are now owned by a German manufacturing company called ThyssenKrupp. But Budd no longer exists as like a going concern, like nobody works there. But while you probably haven't heard of Budd, if you grew up in Chicago, you've likely used their product. Budd made trains mostly. And in the 1950s, they figured out a design to make expensive but extremely high quality train cars that required less maintenance than previous train cars, but still lasted basically forever. I couldn't tell you the details, but as I understand it, it involves some sort of design problem about like rust. So for a few decades, this was amazing. Lots of cities wanted to buy these low maintenance trains, and they sold tens of thousands of the things. So you've likely been on one. Chicago's CTA bought a bunch of Budd train cars in the 1960s through the 1980s. And while most of these were replaced in 2010, the last of them, bought when the CTA extended the Blue Line to O'Hare back in the 80s, are still running. Metra has some cars that still run. The New York Subway and the Metro North commuter rail still run some Budd train cars. The MBTA commuter rails that serve my hometown in Greater Boston are Budd train cars, purchased in the early 1970s and still running outdoors year-round in Massachusetts for 50 years, and they have not rusted out. That's quality, right? Subway systems and heavy rail passenger lines from Canada to Brazil to Japan to Australia use cars built by Budd or by local manufacturers licensing Budd designs. So now, from an industrial design and engineering standpoint, this is an astonishing success. But from a business standpoint, it's a complete disaster. The problem that Bud has was that their trains were too well built and too reliable. So transit authorities that bought Bud trains for their transit systems could then confidently go without buying any new train cars for like 50 years. But there are only about 180 metro systems in the world now, and there were fewer back in the 70s. So I'm sure these transit systems felt like they got great value, but the company can't just hibernate for 60 years while they wait for the trains they sold to wear out and be replaced. So they saturated their market because the trains they built were more durable than the business they built. So one way of thinking about the history of General Motors is that it's a history of finding inventive ways around the problem that did in Bud. So the first key innovation came from an executive named Alfred P. Sloan. And this was the model year. Because GM, unlike Bud, sold to consumers, they could make changes, like aesthetic changes in styling that exaggerate the differences between, say, a 1956 Pontiac and a 1957 Pontiac. It's fashion, basically. You guys have heard of like fins on cars and so on. And so this helps make cars feel old and out of date before they are broken down, encouraging people to buy new cars more quickly than they might otherwise, and helps to stave off the problem of market saturation. You'll notice that a lot of these classic American cars are still running, but often it's in, parts of Latin America, like poorer parts of Latin America, typically, where these things have been exported from the United States, like Cuba. But like the cars were good and they still work, right? So GM has been stylistically differentiating its model years since the 1920s. Now all automakers and many makers of consumer products, like a cell phone, say, do the same thing. So this is why there's a business case to make something ludicrous like a foldable cell phone, even if the industrial design case is pretty shaky.
So as you can see, the screen on our Galaxy Fold is broken. I've got a line here and a line here, and here's what happened. Right about here under the screen last night, I noticed that I could feel a little bump under the screen when it was completely open. And when it wasn't completely open, I didn't feel the bump at all.
Samsung wants to give people a reason to move on from their still perfectly good cell phone that they bought in 2017 or whatever. They want to sell you another phone. But this model depends on growing consumer incomes. If people don't have the money to buy another phone, they're not going to buy another phone. If people don't have the money to buy a new car, they're not going to buy a new car. And so middle class and working class American incomes have been basically stalled out in real terms, which is to say adjusted for inflation, since the 1970s. So wages have been growing at about the same rate as inflation, which means workers have not been making any more money, even as they've gotten raises. So if you're trying to deliver growth to your investors as a company that sells things to consumers, like cars, that's a big problem for you. The other thing that happened in the 1970s was the oil crisis, in which the oil-producing countries of OPEC, many of which had recently gained their independence in the post-World War II wave of decolonization, began to cut oil supply in a coordinated manner to raise prices that the rest of the world paid and make themselves richer countries. This is sort of where all these sort of Gulf monarchies in the Middle East got rich, right? Oil prices basically tripled overnight, and then they doubled again a decade later. So the huge, stylish, expensive cars that made up GM model lines in the 1960s suddenly seemed very expensive to operate. If more of consumers' transportation budget was going to be taken up by fuel costs, they couldn't afford as many cars or to have the cars they bought be as large and inefficient as before. So indeed, the smaller cars that were popular in places like Europe and Asia started to seem more attractive and competitive to American car buyers.
Well, where can poor starving interns find a car?
Poor starving interns can afford.
You asked for it. The Toyota Corolla two-door sedan. Probably the most sensible car in the world. 49 highway, 36 city. And you get Toyota durability and reliability at an incredibly low sticker price. Toyota. It's just common sense.
I'm starving.
You asked for it, you got it, Toyota.
And so the General Motors business model was under strain. And they responded, again, with another business innovation, financialization. So this arrived in the late 70s, early 80s. So GM had as part of its corporate structure, a bank called GMAC, the General Motors Acceptance Corporation. to issue loans to its customers since basically the beginning. But in the 1980s, with the oil crisis and high interest rates, they had some executives in Detroit had the clever idea of letting their profit margins on the cars fall way down. That's normally not what you want, making the cars cheaper and more attractive to consumers, and then making up the difference, making up what they lose in the high purchase prices by charging more for the loans that they give consumers to buy them. So this solved two problems at once. Consumers can't afford to buy as many cars as they could 10 years ago. Lend them the money. Can't make a lot of profit selling smaller, cheaper cars with low margins? Don't even try. Sell the cars only a hair above their cost of production and make money on the financing. So GM used to be a company that made its money selling cars and issued a few auto loans in order to sell more cars. Now, instead, we have a situation in which GM is a company that makes its money selling loans, auto loans initially, but eventually home loans and credit cards and other consumer-facing loans, and sells cars for a small profit in order to sell more loans. The oil crisis and stagnating consumer spending created a challenging competitive environment for GM that prompted them to switch their profit center from cars to financing for cars. It made it harder for the company to sustain growth as just an automaker, so they needed to look elsewhere to achieve that growth. GM became a bank that also made cars. By 2006, GMAC, the banking subsidiary of GM, was worth more in market capitalization than the rest of the automaker. Now, the 2008 housing crisis completely upended that business. As you might imagine, GMAC's portfolio of consumer loans was in a pretty rough shape in 2008 as the housing crisis put a lot of people's home and auto loans in default. Also, the slow recovery since 2008 has meant persistent low interest rates, and that's made it very hard to make a lot of money selling consumer loans. So the Obama administration responded by restructuring GM. They took the company into federal receivership and then spun it back off, reorganized in 2010. So as part of that restructuring, they turned most of GMAC into an independent company, which is now called Ally Financial. GM owns like a small fraction of the new company. I think it's like 10%. So after 25 years of success, financialization sort of hit a brick wall in 2008 and petered out as an effective strategy for the automaker. It turns out that consumer borrowing can only support consumer spending up to a point, but their shareholders still need some growth. They're looking for that growth. It's not enough to just have a successful business selling cars that people like and making steady profits. You need growth. So what has GM done to find a source of growth? One of the things they're trying now, and this finally brings us to the topic of this lecture, they're beginning to sell information. So in other words, as of just a few years ago, GM, Google, and Facebook are all in the same business. Just like Google or Facebook want to use what they learn about your life by following how you use the web or phone applications in order to sell advertisers lucrative access to ever narrower audiences sliced up more and more finely that will find their messages relevant. So too does GM want to do this with what they learn about the people who drive their cars. The car is like a web browser in this analogy. To be clear, this isn't yet a large part of GM's revenue, and perhaps it never will be, but it is a new initiative that they are pursuing as they seek new ways of finding profits in a challenging business environment. But what matters here is that this isn't an accident. Each wave of this process has been motivated by investors looking for opportunities for growth as the returns from earlier business models petered out. So as a given business model soaks up all the demand it can, companies have to start looking for new sources of revenue. So in the 80s, they looked to financing to increase consumer spending power and try to profit from that. Now, with households drawing down their debts and interest rates very low, companies and investors are moving their attention from selling things or financing things to basically earning commissions on whatever consumer spending happens. And so this is the attention economy. So, okay, so what is the attention economy? How do these ad tech businesses work? Consumer spending in the United States has been flat for years now, but it remains a ton of money. It's annually, consumer spending is something on the order of 13 trillion with a T dollars, which is about $40,000 for every person in the country. Well, I can confidently forecast that that will be way down for 2020, given our current circumstances. It remains a massive fire hose of money, a Niagara Falls of money. So the job of marketers, right, is to siphon off a fraction of that money, to just like get a little straw in there and draw out a stream of it. The old way to do that was to target advertisement to different kinds of publications or media broadcasts, and magazines or newspapers or television shows. We still see plenty of this. So one of the places where the sort of traditional model is still working is in live sports. I like to watch baseball so much that with American Baseball Shuttered, I just over the weekend subscribed to online access to the Taiwanese Baseball League, the only league in the world currently playing. I've watched like 6 innings of one game. It's pretty fun. Okay, baseball's audience skews older and it skews male. And so advertisers who want to sell things to older men who want to address that market segment with their products will advertise on baseball broadcasts. So typically when I'm watching baseball, I see lots of ads for pharmaceuticals, treatments for heart disease, help quitting smoking, erectile dysfunction ads for like money managers, like somebody who's going to, manage your investments, ads for pickup trucks, ads for the kind of questionable jewelry that straight men can be led to believe their wives and girlfriends want them to buy for them. But a lot of people watch baseball, not just old men. Women are about a third of the audience, for instance, and younger people, are a big chunk. And so the companies who are spending their ad budget on these broadcasts, they're paying to advertise to a lot of people who are unlikely to buy their products, right? And so, this is, sports is one example. You could also talk about television shows, magazines, newspapers, radio programs, et cetera. So the business model of the publication, let's say a magazine, was to produce content that would attract the attention of a fairly well-defined readership, say stylish young women, and then sell advertisements to brands that were seeking to reach that audience. So you see different ads in Elle magazine than you would see in Field and Stream because the audiences are different. And the audiences are different because the content of the magazines are different. But this, the reasoning went, was an inefficient way to target audiences. What if instead of targeting by the audience of the broadcast medium or publication you were sponsoring, you directly targeted the audience themselves using technology to follow them around to the various different things they consume? What if there was a way to know who was interested in erectile dysfunction medications, designer handbags, or pickup trucks, rather than just, marketing erectile dysfunction meds to everybody who watches baseball? So this is the whole premise of ad tech. Firms like Google and Facebook give consumers useful services for free. Google provides their search product that we all use every day. They provide Gmail, Google Maps, the Android telephone operating system, right? All of this is free. Facebook provides their various services, the Facebook social networking site, Instagram, WhatsApp, et cetera. They make all these things. They have all these products. Those are free. These are expensive services to run and manage. So they need to, make money on this. What they get in return is your attention. And by watching what you do with your time while logged into their platforms, they learn a lot about their users, i.e. you. And they use that information about their users to provide a valuable service to their customers. So the customers, the actual customers, are brands who want to identify which of those users are likely to be most receptive to their marketing and are willing to pay Google and Facebook and all of these other ad tech companies a little bit to find out. So Google learns a lot about what's on your mind based on what you search for. This information can be extremely valuable, especially when they're able to discern what the industry calls purchase intention. If you start searching for information about a product category, Google software will draw an inference that you might be interested in purchasing such a thing. So at each page load, in a fraction of a second, they run a little auction for advertisers who had, said how much they would be willing to pay for clicks from users with such an identified purchase intention. And so most of these are just a few pennies a click, most of these auctions. So you click on an ad and Google gets 9 cents or something. But some of them are considerably more valuable. The classic example, and I think I raised this in in class in one of the sections is the search term mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a kind of lung cancer that people get from exposure to asbestos, a flame retardant that was once widely used in building construction, and that we now know is really dangerous. And if you're searching for that term, it's medium likely that you've just been diagnosed with this intreatable lung cancer and you're about to sue someone. And that someone is probably your boss. You know, like the people who tend to get exposed to this are people who are doing construction work, like renovating old buildings and so on. So court settlements for this kind of thing are huge, and lawyers can make a lot of money securing them. So that means that law firms are willing to drop a lot of money, like $100 a click, from someone who is interested in mesothelioma, because that's not something that like we're just recreationally searching for all the time. Like nobody's like, you know, there's some people who are just interested in watches. Nobody's just casually interested in mesothelioma. Yeah, it's not fun. So other examples of valuable search terms are things like termites, pest control, and plumber. Clicks on those terms often cost about $30. The assumption seems to be that people seeking these services often go with the first company they call. I mean, if you're calling a plumber, you probably have an urgent problem that you want fixed right now. and then once you've gone with a plumber, once you have a plumber, you're going to stick with that plumber. You have a plumber. You just like program their name into your cell phone, right? So being the first company that someone calls is really valuable to those, you know, plumbing companies. So, you know, so they're willing to pay $30 a click, right? Searches for the term casino are worth even more. You get the idea. So in this way, Google manages to interpose itself into a huge swath of economic activity, picking up a few cents here when someone searches for a place to buy a sandwich, $15 there when someone looks for an auto loan, $100 on the odd search for a rare medical condition. But these payments are made only when people click on the ads, not the normal non-advertisement links. But the ads on the normal links, you'll notice, are increasingly similar looking, and that's not an accident. So Facebook does basically the same thing. Facebook learns who your friends and family are, where you go to school, where you work, what you might be interested in, what you post about, and so on, what links you click on that other people posted. So if your brother is getting married, Facebook probably knows that, and they can infer from that that you might be about to buy a new dress. That information is valuable to advertisers. There are today, mostly in California, a whole universe of data brokers, demand-side platforms, data management platforms, and so forth, trying to connect the various information that can be gleaned about literally everyone on Earth, from various web-based trackers, customer loyalty programs, cell phone analytics, social media accounts, search histories, Bluetooth beacons in stores that can tell how much time your phone spends in which aisles of the store, and so on. So the markets for wearable tech and smart appliances are part of this same impulse. The business model behind, say, a smart fridge, like this one from Samsung, is to interpose Samsung into the marketing and purchasing decisions involved in a given, household's food purchases. If you buy this fridge, suddenly Samsung knows what brand of mayonnaise you buy, or when you're almost out of eggs. General Motors was jostling to get into this kind of business, to find a way of synthesizing the records from your web browser, your social interactions, your cell phone, and your car into a total picture of your every waking intention. So eventually the idea would be to anticipate these intentions. So this kind of utopian, or maybe it would be better to say dystopian vision, would be of this all coming together into a seamless landscape of, I guess, unbounded consumer assistance. So of getting a notification from your Samsung smart fridge's cell phone application that you're out of eggs, just at the moment that you tell your Chevy Malibu to give you a low traffic route home from work, and having it suggest a route that takes you right by a Jewel-Osco. Should a picker at Jewel-Osco put a bag together from the shopping list prepared by your fridge that you could then pick up curbside? How convenient. And I bet the grocery store would be happy to give Samsung and GM a few pennies from your grocery purchase. I have to say, I'm doubtful that this vision will ever quite materialize. People have been saying for more than a decade that most of these companies I mean, we're not talking about Google and Facebook. We're talking about the smaller, lesser known companies that most of them just cannot succeed. That there are too many companies fighting over ever smaller slices of stagnant consumer spending. And this critique of this industry's business case is probably true. And it's actually quite likely that the present crisis in which spending on advertisement is collapsing along with consumer spending is going to entirely reshape this industry for better or quite possibly for worse. And we might look back at this actually as the end of the Bay Area's tech boom. People have a number of concerns about this business model. One, naturally, is privacy. Even if it is computer programs rather than people that are, sifting through your email or web search history or drawing conclusions based on your social relationships, it can be a little bit creepy to realize that that ad you're seeing is because the algorithms noticed you walking through a given aisle in Target 6 days ago and pausing. But I find more interesting some of the ramifications for media, because what's troubling about in that situation is what this business model wants is to bring as much of your attention and activity into the places that it can watch you as possible. So the engineers at places like Twitter or YouTube are not trying to produce a satisfying experience for you so much as they are trying to keep you scrolling, keep you clicking on the next video, scrolling through a few more sponsored posts. These platforms optimize for, their word for this kind of addiction is engagement. But in their algorithmic neutrality, they are often indifferent about whether that engagement means watching borderline fascist conspiracy theory videos about the deep state or identifying online anti-Semites as an addressable market for advertisers. The platforms don't see themselves as having any obligation to curtail objectively dangerous conversations like anti-vax discourse, for instance. And so the theme uniting the readings I shared with you this week, from Jenny Odell's essay, which is marvelous, to the ProPublica and Columbia Journalism Review investigations into various political questions around social media and the attention economy, to the TED Talks from Eli Pariser and Zeynep Tufekci, is that the attention economy has grave risks for people's mental and emotional health, and also for the health of society. So each of these essays and talks thinks about those risks and what should be done about them in different ways. But what I want to sort of emphasize is that they're really talking about a unified sort of theory of the relationship between and among, this is stuff we were talking about back before we went online, between and among advertising, media, and public life, right? Democracy maybe. And so these are important things for us to think about.